Let's talk about bees.
Bees?
I spent a frankly absurd amount of time testing the output of apiaries under various conditions and collected all of that data to determine if I thought it was worth the cost of a valuable development point. I hate having to watch a 20-minute video and the 30 seconds of information I actually care about is at the very end. So, retention be damned. I'll just go ahead and give you that now. Apiaries pretty consistently give you about 6 honey in the first month and average an output of 3 to 5 per month after that. The most efficient setup in terms of materials and workers, in my opinion, is 2 apiaries with 1 worker per. There does seem to be some hidden factor that determines the output of honey, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So, are apiaries worth the development point? Maybe. Vegetable gardens on your burgage plots will outproduce them, but take longer to start being useful and cost regional wealth. Forager huts can also produce more food, but are unusable during the winter. Hunting camps produce a pretty good amount of food and hides, but you may have to slow down on those as the animal population lowers. So I guess my final recommendation on it is, if you aren't focusing on farming or mining, apiaries are definitely worth the investment. In villages that are specifically focused on trading, I could definitely see myself picking up the perk, as getting 2 more development points for the 2 trading perks is pretty easy. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk numbers. Before we get too deep into this, let's define the test parameters and the data that was collected. Each of the tests were set up with no off-map AI, no raiders, no bandit camps, double starting supplies, and no weather events. This was done to allow me to focus purely on getting apiaries quickly without having to deal with enemy distractions or loss of supplies. The tested scenarios were 1 apiary with 1 worker, 1 apiary with 2 workers, 1 apiary with 4 workers, and 2 apiaries with 1 worker per. I would be interested in seeing what 2 apiaries with 4 workers per could produce, but honestly, I got tired of staring at a number change while a peasant talked about feeding month-old grain to his ox for the 100th time. Actual supply of honey was logged at 1 month of production, 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years. An important note is that these numbers are not total produced, just what was uneaten and still existed within the village. I thought this might be the more realistic view of what you could expect to have during normal play. To be clear, this is actual supply, not surplus. That being said, there was one test where I got curious and logged the total amount produced, but we'll get to that. I also tracked the fertility of each area for reasons we'll get into later. Granted, I graded the fertility of each region pretty arbitrarily, denoting them as good, great, and bad. Great means that there's green plus 3 areas everywhere. Good means I wouldn't be too upset if I were doing a farming run there. And bad is mostly, well, bad. No green, lots of red and orange. One last note, I'm not a statistician, sorry. Alright, let's take a look at the first test. The first test was in Eichenau with good fertility. The apiary started production in August of the first year. The village had 1 worker and a hunting camp and 2 vegetable gardens. Eichenau had very low honey consumption, and I feel that this is the test that gave the best baseline results, as we get the clearest picture of actual units produced, rather than just what is still in the larders during each period. More on consumption later. After 1 month of production, 6 units of honey were available. This turned out to be fairly consistent across all single apiary tests, for the most part. After 6 months, there were 20 units of honey available. At 1 year, there were 43, and at 2 years, the village was sitting on a stockpile of 84 units. Next, the same test was done in Immenruth, with great fertility. The apiary started production in November of year 1, and the village had 1 worker at a forager's hut and 3 vegetable gardens. Immenruth also had a little bit of a food crisis, and seemed to greatly prefer honey to all other food sources. More on this later. At 1 month, we see 6 units of honey again. After 6 months, 10 units available. At 1 year, 27 units, and at 2 years, 41. Again, Immenruth consumed honey at a pretty high rate. I expect results would have been more in line with the iCanal test had consumption been lower. Finally, Zvio was tested with bad fertility. Zvio had 1 worker in a hunting camp, 1 in a forager's hut, and 3 vegetable gardens. Production started in January of year 2. Zvio had an even higher rate of consumption than Emenruth did. At 1 month, 8 units were produced. After 6 months, there were 32 units available. At 1 year, 39, and at 2 years, 21. Due to the extreme consumption, numbers look kind of low here, but going off of the 1 month and 6 month data, I suspect that at 2 years, Zvio could have easily had close to 100 units, if not more. This was the first real variant seen in the 1st month and 6 month recordings. We'll talk more about this later, but something makes hunting more efficient in some regions than others. That concludes the first round of tests. Let's look at the same apiaries with an additional worker. Back in iCanal, we run the test again with 2 workers. We have 6 units being produced in the 1st month again. At 6 months, we have 22 units. At 1 year, we have 49, and at 2 years, 92. It seems like as time goes on, the benefit of having an additional worker increases, maybe. Emenruth again. At 1 month, we see 6 units. Not too surprising after we saw the same thing in iCanal. At 6 months, we still only have 6 units available. Again, Emenruth had a pretty high consumption of honey. This made me log actual units produced in the next test, but we'll get there shortly. At 1 year, we had 22 units, and at 2 years, 43. We actually saw a lower supply at the 6 month and 1 year marks compared to the single worker test, but the number finally pulls ahead at the 2 year mark. Again, it seems like additional workers becomes more valuable as time goes on, rather than providing an immediate benefit. Back to Zvio. At the 1 month mark, we have 7 units. Fewer than the single worker test, interestingly, but that could just be that a peasant got distracted or something. At 6 months, we have 32 units, still very in line with what we saw with the single worker. At 1 year, heavy consumption has started and we have 28 units. At 2 years, we only have 8 in storage. Now, I did record actual units produced on this test. I kind of wish I had done this for every test, but this would have required rerunning all the previous tests, meaning multiple hours of lost progress. Additionally, it also means watching the numbers like a hawk, which, I don't know, I'm lazy, sorry. Anyway, in the end, Zvio produced 117 units of honey over 2 years. Pretty big improvement over iCanal's 92. Wrapping up the second round of tests, my thoughts are that adding a second worker to the apiary just isn't really worth it, at least not for the first year. Maybe over a longer period of time we would see greater benefits, but I wasn't wowed with these results. For the final single apiary test, we now add 2 more workers for a total of 4. Starting in iCanal, we see 6 units produced in the 1st month. Again. At 6 months, we see 20 units. Again. At 1 year, we have 44 units. Actually fewer than the 2 worker test, but 1 more than the single worker test. At 2 years, we have 94 units. 10 more than the single worker apiary, and only 2 more than the 2 worker apiary. Over in Emenruth, we have 6 units after 1 month. Okay. At 6 months, we have 3 units. After 1 year, 9 units, and at 2 years, 45. While consumption was high during the first year, we did see the numbers start to pull ahead towards the end of the test, with a slight improvement over the 2 apiary test, which itself was already a small increase over the single worker test. Back to Zvio. At the end of the 1st month, we have 8 units. Pretty consistent with its previous test. At 6 months, we have 35. At 1 year, 19, and at 2 years, 9. Again, Zvio had a very heavy consumption, but I expect we would have seen similar results to the 2 worker test, somewhere in the ballpark of 110 to 120 total production. From the data, it doesn't seem worth the investment to put 4 workers in an apiary. If you have a massive surplus of people, maybe, but otherwise I'd just stick with 1 worker, at least for the first year or 2. Now, let's look at 2 apiaries. This is where it gets interesting, I think. For this test, we'll be doing 2 apiaries with 1 worker per. For iCanal, this test will now start in September of year 1, but all other parameters are the same. In the first month, we see 10 units of honey produced. At 6 months, we have 42. After 1 year, 85, and at 2 years, 161. For the most part, we're actually seeing about what I expected, approximately double the values we saw in the single apiary test with 1 worker. In Emmenruth, our test now starts in December of year 1, and the town also has a hunting camp now, in addition to the forager's hut and the 3 vegetable gardens. In the first month, we produce 9 units of honey. After the 6-month mark, we have 26. At 1 year, we have 54, and at 2 years, 129. Here's where we see the most improvement in supply, but this could be due to the fact that the village has another source of food from the hunting camp. Though the honey consumption seemed much the same to previous tests. Noticeably, at the 2-year mark, we see 3 times the amount of honey available. For our final test, we move back to Zvayal. Our test starts in February of year 2 now. All other parameters are the same. At 1 month, we have 13 units of honey. At 6 months, 42. At 1 year, we have 95. And at 2 years, 101. There's not much improvement until the first year, where we start seeing dramatically improved supply, going from 39 units in the single worker test, the previous highest value for this region, to 95, and 21 at 2 years to 101. My biggest takeaway from these tests is, if you're going to make use of apiaries, build 2 of them, and stock them with 1 worker per. After a year or 2, maybe throw a few more people at them, but for the cost of 4 planks and 2 families, this is an excellent way to secure a year-round consistent food source. Now, there are some other things I wanted to talk about, but we're kind of getting outside the realm of tested and concrete facts and into some more tinfoil hat type stuff. I wanted to do these tests because I was using honey as one of my early game food sources while doing test runs for the merchant achievement. And I was seeing kind of inconsistent value from the apiaries. Sometimes they were amazing. Other times they were just kind of mediocre. Looking through a few saves I was using for these merchant achievement test runs, I started to notice that the regions where honey production seemed better were the areas where fertility was low. And that got me wondering if there is actually some kind of inverse fertility correlation for honey production. After running all the tests we just went through, I actually did run one final test. I started a new game in iCanal with bad fertility, comparable to Zvayal's fertility in its test. I built an apiary and tracked its total production over the course of 3 months. After 1 month, it produced 6 honey. Less than I expected, but standard, I guess. After 2 months, it had produced 6 more. At the 3-month mark, it had produced yet another 6 for a total of 18 honey over the course of 3 months. Looking back at the first iCanal single apiary single worker test, this apiary had almost produced in 3 months what the first test had produced in 6. This isn't really enough to prove my theory about fertility being linked to honey production, but I do think it warrants more testing. If there's enough interest in this, I'll do some deeper research and try to do some more thorough testing. Another thing that caught my attention during all these tests, food preference. In Emmenruth and especially Zvayal, it seemed like the villagers preferred honey to all other foods, regardless of supply. At one point, I even reran the Emmenruth test with a healthier food supply to see if the first test's high honey consumption was due to lack of other foods. But even with overflowing pantries, the villagers always ate honey first. I have a couple theories about this. My first thought is that this could just be a supply issue. There are limited families setting up food stalls, and honey is just what they happen to grab from the granary to put on the market. Apiaries in these tests were typically built near the granary and the residential district to minimize travel time for both workers and teamsters moving goods around. Maybe the granary has a last in, first out priority for stocking market stalls. I don't really know. Another thought is that when you start a new game, villagers have a predetermined food preference. I really want to test this once more tools are available. My thought is that if you started multiple new games with, say, 20 units of every food type, would you see the food supply reduce evenly? Would it be random? Or would you see certain foods getting eaten more quickly than others, and would those preferred foods change from game to game? Anyway, that's enough about crazy untested ideas, I guess. To wrap up, I'll leave you with my final thoughts. Apiaries are worth the investment if you aren't prioritizing farming or mining and planning to skip those perks. I think it's a reasonable choice if you're going to do a trading village, as there's only 2 perks you really need for that type of run. If you are going to utilize apiaries, build 2 of them and only stick 1 family in each, at least until you have enough spare people to add more. And even then, I think it's better if the apiaries have already been producing for a couple of years. I'd love to see Slavic magic add the ability to use honey to produce mead, and for that matter, apples to produce cider. As it currently stands, ale is a huge bottleneck for level 3 houses. I think very few people are going to pick up beekeeping in its current state, but it could become a very important perk if it could be used to produce booze. Especially if you're in a region where farming isn't an option and you haven't picked up the trading perks that make importing a viable option. Anyway, that's all I've really got. Hopefully this information was valuable to somebody. It took a very long time to run these tests and record and organize all the data. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all in the next one. Have a good one.